My name is Jamal ElShayyal. I work for Al Jazeera Media Network. I am a correspondent who's covered a lot of the events that we've alluded to or referenced in some of these talks. On this specific session here, as well as maybe the troublemaker in the family as well, it's apt that I am here to discuss with some of the most esteemed scholars in their field the challenges facing and the troubles facing the Muslim world. We are going to try and divvy up the time enough for a enriched discussion to take place afterwards, so I don't want to talk too much. I'll start by introducing Dr. Richard Falk, who will be discussing the first of those challenges, and that is that of hegemony. So Dr. Falk, I don't know if you'd like to take the stand or...
Thank you very much. Dear friends and colleagues, it's a real privilege to participate in this important conference, really a historic conference, I think. And I'm very grateful to Professor Al-Arian for including me. He overlooked the fact that I have no real credentials to participate, and that was an act of empathy, compassion. And I want to also congratulate the sponsors and conveners for initiating what seems to me to be a very promising scholarly undertaking. And it's of course always a privilege to be there at the initiation of something that is new and promising. Let me try to situate this challenge of hegemony in relation to the larger theme of the Muslim Ummah. And after listening to these very provocative and stimulating presentations, I'm partly enlightened and partly confused, which I suspect is not I'm not alone in that, having that combination of feelings. But what I think is relevant to this inquiry into hegemony as it affects the Muslim world is that it's, as others have noted, one of the most difficult challenges of decolonization is the decolonization of the mind. And the search for a new paradigm is in its essence a way of gaining intellectual, political, cultural autonomy, independence. It's not enough to have membership in the UN or to have the symbols of sovereignty. This mental decolonization is the biggest challenge of all. What one might also call internalized Orientalism or self-Orientalism, which is very insidious, because if you're dealing with an externalized adversary, you know what to do, you know how to resist. But if it's internalized, it takes great political ingenuity and imagination to know even that you're afflicted. It's like having a disease with no name and no cure. And that's why it's very important that I see this from being outside the immediate context. I see this conference in that light as a exploration in decolonizing the mind, to put it that way. And what I think is another way of trying to get at the same thing is that thinking about these larger issues of community, identity, and economy from this perspective of the Ummah is a counter-hegemonic undertaking that itself is a way of opposing those forces that are dominating, exploiting, corrupting, and in a sense, destroying the prospects of human happiness, human well-being. And so in that sense, it is inevitably a political project, and a political project to somehow overcome, in part, these legacies of colonialism, these lingering legacies of colonialism, and they're not only internal. So I would regard the unresolved problem of Palestine to be an externalized, lingering legacy of colonialism that is paradoxical in the sense that at the very moment when colonialism was collapsing throughout the world, Israel countered the historical trend and established what amounts to, even though it's not called as such, established a very coercive colonial political formation. And not only did it establish it, it legitimated it to a considerable degree, membership in the UN, relations with other countries, many other countries, increasing number, and through the effective establishment of its presence. In other words, legitimacy is not only a claim to right, it's also the effective establishment of that right. And so if power generates rights, in effect, and I'm not a realist, but that's, that part of our political experience is important to reckon with. And I think that what is at stake, in a sense, with this counter-hegemonic posture is how to challenge, deconstruct, and, if possible, replace these Euro-American categories by which we think about the world. And that starts with the nation state, and that starts with nationalism, that's the ideology of the nation state, and it extends to the neoliberal capitalist economy. And these various realities have been imposed on the Muslim world and is part of this internalized landscape. Because time is precious in this setting, let me very briefly try to summarize the experience of hegemony in the Arab world in particular, and the Muslim world more generally. And of course, the first stage of it was the period immediately after the Ottoman Empire's collapse, and is symbolized by two extraordinarily extensions of colonial ambition. Maybe that's the best way to put it. The British and French colonial systems exhibited extreme colonial ambition in the aftermath of World War I, and really carved up the region into artificial political communities that could only be stabilized by coercive rule. and at the same time proclaimed ideologically a sympathy for democracy, a very confusing kind of messaging from the West to the Muslim world. And so you had the Sykes-Picot Agreement and the Balfour Declaration as really underlying the terrible turmoil and tyrannical governance that is so prevalent in the region and should not be forgotten. After World War II, the second stage, what colonial ambition was largely and gradually displaced by what I would call geopolitical ambition, not as clearly disclosed, not as evident, self-evident as the colonial earlier period that itself was compromised by historical tendencies and ended up with the mandate system, but it was still a disguised colonial kind of tutelage of the non-Western Muslim world. So that political independence occurred after World War II in the region, but it was neutralized by these global, geopolitical ambitions. First the Europeans, and then they were displaced in turn by the Americans. And in this dynamic, after World War II, which was basically stabilized by the rivalry between the Soviet Union and the United States, and it was this geopolitically driven stability was decisively challenged by the Iranian Revolution. The Iranian Revolution was the first major counter-hegemonic development in the region, and it was important not just for Iran, as the leaders understood. It was important for the Islamic world as a whole. And Ayatollah Khomeini was very, very clear about that vision of it, the significance of what happened in Iran. And that, in turn, created a new challenge to the hegemonic project, because it meant that there was a hostile to the West and to secularism and modernity. These forces were suddenly unleashed in a way that threatened the stability that had existed. And then the next important stage is after the Cold War. And you had this sense of a more concentrated geopolitical ambition that was given a particular emphasis by the importance of petropolitics. Yeah, I get the bad news. The importance of petropolitics and the influence of Israel on the shaping of American foreign policy in the region, creating a new situation. The post-Cold War situation was a new situation which converged with this sense, particularly by what we in the U.S. call neoconservatives, the neoconservative sense that there was an opportunity to restructure the internal politics of several of the important countries in the region. And the Iraq War of 2003 was the sort of prime example and the big failure of that kind of initiative. But the most important geopolitical move, which has not been, I think, adequately appreciated, is the idea that the future of international politics and global hegemony will be determined in this region. Not in Europe. See, it had been in Europe through the 20th century, through all of the 20th century, but now it was going to be in the Muslim world because of oil and natural gas, because of the challenge posed by political Islam, because of the risks of combining this challenge with nuclear proliferation. Suddenly, the strategic stakes in this region escalated to unprecedented levels, and was then again challenged by the Arab uprisings that we heard so interestingly discussed in the last session, which was another, of course, counter-hegemonic development in the region. And the third counter-hegemonic development that I would mention is the 9/11 attacks on the US that generated this new war on terror, which was a new pretext for hegemony. It wasn't really, it pretended to be about security, but it was really about resources and control and ideology. And I think understanding it in that way is really very important. I know the chair is glaring at me, and so I should bring my remarks to a happy ending. And let me say that the end of hegemony, if we can envision that, and it's extremely important to envision it, is partly this a new imaginary, maybe a better way to talk about it than a new paradigm, a new horizon of the political, moral, and cultural imagination as one aspect of that. A second aspect would be something that has to happen if we're to have a peaceful and just world, which is the end of violent geopolitics. The colonial system understood that, came to understand that. The US, unfortunately, has not yet understood that military superiority has lost its historical agency. The US should have learned that lesson in the Vietnam War, where it had every kind of military superiority yet lost the war. But it can't think outside the military box, and so it keeps repeating in different forms the failure that was so epitomized by the Vietnam outcome. And there will be no real shift in this Muslim Ummah setting unless the open wound of the Palestinian suffering is not healed. That is an indispensable precondition for a peaceful and just future for the region. And finally is the need to think through how to avoid the invidious and conflictual zero-sum nature of the way in which capitalism is now imposing itself on our collective and individual well-being. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Falk. Moving on, and you've set up the next speaker pretty well in terms of the topic and the challenge of wars and terrorism. It is something that plagues the Muslim Ummah, both geographically and also from a let's say mental point of view on the minds of many of those who would affiliate to it. So let's introduce Dr. Flynt from Penn State University.
Assalamu alaikum. I'd like to start by adding my own words of thanks to the conference organizers for inviting me. It is a pleasure to be with all of you. It is certainly an honor to be on the same panel with Richard Falk and John Esposito, and it's a special blessing to share the stage with a man who's inspired me every day I've been privileged to know him, our friend Dr. Sami Al-Arian. Professor Falk and I didn't coordinate this, but he has set me up really nicely, and I thank him for that. Understanding the challenge that wars and terrorism pose to the Ummah starts, I think, by recognizing this challenge at its source as a function of America's determination to remain the Middle East's dominant external power. That determination flows from U.S. policymakers' assessment over decades that primacy in the Middle East is central to America's global strategic position. As Professor Falk noted, access to Persian Gulf hydrocarbons has been a consistent driver of American Middle East policy, but U.S. interest in those resources has never been primarily about Persian Gulf hydrocarbons meeting America's energy needs. Rather, since the early days of the post-World War II period, the U.S. interest in Persian Gulf hydrocarbons has been about controlling who gets access to those resources and leveraging that control to bolster U.S. power and influence in other important parts of the world, especially Europe and Asia. Since the 1970s, asserting responsibility for securing Persian Gulf oil and gas flows has also been key to keeping the dollar, the world's leading transactional and reserve currency, something that U.S. policymakers have long seen as vital to preserving America's, I'll call it, deficit superpower grand strategy. For these reasons, successive U.S. administrations have worked since the end of World War II to consolidate a highly militarized, pro-U.S. political and security order in the Middle East. In many ways, the Cold War imposed some significant constraints on U.S. efforts to do this. But since the Cold War ended, and remember, the end of the Cold War coincided with prosecution of the First Persian Gulf War, Washington has judged itself freer to forge a highly militarized pro-U.S. regional order in the Middle East and to ostracize and undermine regional actors unwilling to subordinate their strategic independence to such an arrangement. This has shaped, I would argue, a consistent and highly interventionist post-Cold War U.S. approach to the region. Now, of course, one can observe correctly that the George H.W. Bush, Clinton, George W. Bush, Obama, and now Trump administrations differed on various aspects of Middle East policy, the role of Arab-Israeli diplomacy, the declaratory balance between democracy promotion and backing pro-U.S. autocrats, other points you might identify. But those differences are, in the end, tactical. Strategically, all these administrations committed to an ongoing quest for U.S. primacy in the region, grounded in the consolidation of a pro-U.S.-led regional order. Both before and after the Cold War, the ultimate goal of U.S. efforts to forge a highly militarized pro-U.S. political and security order in the Middle East has been to keep truly independent powers from arising in the region. Blocking independent power centers has meant, above all, preventing the emergence of representative political orders in Muslim societies. For American policy elites strongly presume that such orders, which are likely to be defined by some version of what I would call participatory Islamism, those orders fall into that category of regional actors unwilling to subordinate their strategic independence in fundamental ways to U.S. policy preferences. Professor Falk's discussion of revolutionary Iran epitomizes what I'm talking about here. This is the campaigns of militarized regime change, other forms of coercive intervention in the Middle East. And those invasions and campaigns of militarized regime change have created conditions in which extreme and unrepresentative groups like Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State can take root, grow, and evolve. U.S. policy has contributed to this in two major ways, at least. First, U.S. interventions in the Middle East have essentially destroyed existing states in key regional theaters. Iraq and Libya are both prime examples of what I'm talking about. In their wake, those interventions have left governance and security vacuums that unrepresentative militants and their various external patrons have been all too happy to exploit for their own purposes. Second, as U.S. administrations have worked to bring more and more of the Middle East into the kind of highly militarized pro-U.S. regional order I described, those administrations have themselves regularly resorted to arming, funding, and training unrepresentative militants as a tool to advance U.S. policy goals. U.S. administrations have done this in partnership with regional allies, as in Washington's serial collaborations with Saudi Arabia and other Gulf Arab states to arm, fund, and train Sunni militias in various regional theaters. They've also done it in defiance of regional allies' clearly stated opposition, as with America's recurrent support for Kurdish militias, something which I appreciate is, to say the least, a very sensitive issue here in Turkey. Now, whatever the preferences of America's regional allies, when U.S. policymakers have judged that advancing their particular vision of, or version of regional order required supporting unrepresentative militants, they have not hesitated to do so. Since 9/11, Washington has compounded the negative effects of these policies by wielding the mantle of counterterrorism to justify further interventionism and intensified suppression of potentially more representative politics in the region. Now, I have long argued, while I was still in the U.S. government and in the years since I left government, I have argued publicly that this kind of strategic approach to the Middle East does not actually serve long-term American interests properly understood. My perspective on this is very much grounded in my government experience. I served in the U.S. government for more than a decade working on Middle East issues from 1992, just after the first Persian Gulf War, until 2003, just before the invasion of Iraq. Those years mark, in many ways, the high point of U.S. power, influence, standing in the Middle East, certainly, but also globally. During my time in government, I watched as the United States misused, and as a result, dissipated significant measures of its power and influence. And I have to say that from everything I see, this dynamic has only gotten worse since I left government. Overall, U.S. engagement in the Middle East over the past quarter century, since the end of the Cold War, is a textbook example of what Yale historian Paul Kennedy famously described as imperial overstretch, a great power's expansion of strategic ambitions and commitments beyond its capacity to sustain them. In the U.S. case, trying to remake and ultimately subordinate the Middle East through military campaigns, other forms of coercive intervention, has not just failed, it has been profoundly self-damaging to America's international position. By seeking to dominate the region, the United States has imposed missions on its armed forces, that not even the world's most powerful military could accomplish. It has squandered vast human and material resources on a scale that not even the world's largest economy could sustain. And it's eviscerated the perceived legitimacy of US purposes in the region for the vast majority of people who live here. That is the paradox, and one might even say the tragedy, of US foreign policy in the Middle East. By seeking regional dominance, regional primacy, America only makes itself weaker in terms of its capacity to shape important outcomes in a genuinely constructive and positive way. Of course, this US approach is also extremely problematic for Middle Easterners and for the Ummah. US policymakers present American, we like to say, leadership in the Middle East as a source of regional and global public goods, energy security, regional security, counterterrorism, so on. In fact, US efforts to consolidate a highly militarized pro-American political and security order in the Middle East actually work against energy security. Those efforts actually encourage terrorist threats. Pre-9/11 US policy sparked the rise of what I will call, for lack of a better shorthand, jihadi terrorism. Post-9/11 policies and actions by the United States have, on balance, in my view, made the threat of violent jihadi militancy worse. But all that being said, I don't think the United States is going to change its approach to the Middle East anytime soon. As an American who cares about his country's foreign policy, I hope I am wrong in what I just said. But in terms of what I think, the American approach to the Middle East isn't going to change in strategically meaningful ways, certainly not as much as I think it needs to change. So it's important to focus on options for what the Ummah itself can do to address the challenge of wars and terrorism, even if American policy doesn't change fundamentally for the foreseeable future. In broad terms, I think there are basically two options, not mutually exclusive. One is for Muslim countries, especially in the Middle East, to diversify their relationships with extra-regional great powers and work relatively more with other extra-regional powers. As Russia and China both step up their engagement in the Middle East on multiple fronts and in different ways, they present the most salient opportunities for regional countries to intensify their engagement with extra-regional powers other than the United States. And I think it's important for regional countries to pursue those opportunities. Russia and China are both playing expanding and, on balance, let me stress, on balance, in my view, positive roles in the Middle East. Both countries have the potential to play bigger roles in the future. But while I think it's important for regional countries to diversify their relations with extra-regional great powers by deepening their engagement with Russia and China, I don't think this option in and of itself is adequate to address the challenge of war and terrorism. As I said, I think both Russia and China are playing on balance positive roles, but I also recognize that both countries' approaches to the region have aspects that many Middle Easterners can and do see as problematic. Among other things, both have a perspective on counterterrorism that increasingly overlaps with some of the worst aspects of the American approach. I know more about China than Russia in this regard. I go to China a couple of times a year. And over the last couple of years, I've been really struck by the level of both elite and popular alarmism about Islamic extremism, which in terms of dominant Chinese narratives and rhetoric about the subject is increasingly synonymous with Islam itself. There are certainly people in China, scholars, analysts, a not small cadre of officials, who know better. But the trends are not going in the right direction, and increasingly those trends are conditioning policy responses in China, which in my view risk proving deeply counterproductive. when Chinese Muslims, Uyghur Muslims, Hui Muslims, practicing Muslims, basically can't buy Qurans except in Chinese translation, that's not a good sign. So I think that Muslim countries need to diversify their extra-regional great power partnerships, but it's important to recognize that this option is insufficient in itself to address the challenge of wars and terrorism. The other option is for political actors in the Middle East and across the Ummah to take more initiative themselves to shape a regional order less defined by U.S. ambitions. This starts with independent regional powers checking the worst impulses of other regional actors ultimately dependent on a dominant America. Iran and Turkey, in my view, have especially key roles to play in this regard. If you look at the Middle East balance of power in historical perspective within the geography normally defined as the Middle East, one finds Arab, Persian, Turkic power centers. Iran has been a coherent civilizational state for millennia, somewhat like China in that regard. Turkey has also had a coherent political identity grounded in a coherent civilizational identity for a long time. And of course, Turkey has the Ottoman experience and legacy of several centuries as its region's dominant power. Against this backdrop, Iran and Turkey can both be described as natural states in the Middle East. Arab power and political identity, by contrast, has for a long time not been nearly so coherent. Now, as you already know and have been discussing, this fragmentation of Arab political identity over the last 2.5 centuries or so is very much wrapped up with Western penetration of the region, but it's a reality that lends special significance to the strategic choices that Iran and Turkey make. Iran and Turkey also have especially key roles to play because they are the two Muslim majority countries in this part of the world that have made the most progress toward genuinely representative government. In Iran's case, this means trying to integrate participatory politics and elections with principles and institutions of Islamic governance as that is understood from a Shia perspective. In Turkey's case, this means, particularly over the last decade and a half, expanding the space for Turks whose identity is unavoidably defined by religion to engage in politics and be genuinely represented in the political system. And that means that Iran and Turkey are the regional countries most capable of acting in a genuinely independent way when it comes to foreign policy. It also means they are the only regional countries which, at their best, engage with their regional environment in ways that any expansion of political participation in various regional theaters can actually end up empowering these countries' allies. Regional countries that are ultimately dependent on a dominant America forging a pro-US regional order and targeting regional actors who won't subordinate themselves to such an order, they can't say that. Israel can't say that. Saudi Arabia can't say that. But Iran and Turkey, at their best, can say that. And that's why Iran and Turkey have unique potential, I think, to play really critical roles in checking the worst impulses of other regional actors ultimately dependent on a dominant America and the consolidation of a pro-US political and security order in the Middle East. Iranian-Turkish coordination to support Qatar is thwarting expansion of, shall we say, coercive Saudi Emirati micromanagement on the Arabian Peninsula. If Iran and Turkey can cultivate similarly productive coordination on other regional issues, I think this could mark an even bigger contribution to a more balanced regional order. Professor Falk challenged us to envision the end of hegemony. Well, think about a region in which major Middle Eastern powers, including Iran and Turkey, take primary responsibility for dealing with security issues, with geopolitical issues in the region. And if a country like the United States really wants to play a helpful role in managing those issues, then it is welcome. But if the United States is not really prepared to play a helpful role, that's okay, because regional powers will manage things on their own. Think about that. For me at least, that's at least a first significant step down the road toward and into hegemony. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Flynn. Can I ask, is that, the temperature in the room, it's a bit hot? Or, because if it's possible, can we make it a bit colder? Just to make sure that everybody stays sharp. Next challenge to be discussed is that of Islamophobia. It is probably one of the more contemporary ones that hasn't been around as long as the others that we've been trying to decipher and talk about, particularly wars and terrorism, but just as much interlinked. And I'd like to introduce Dr. John Esposito, who obviously you all know of. So without further ado.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the President and Dr. Al-Arian for the invitation to come to the conference. I especially want to thank Sami because I asked him how long I had. He said 17 minutes. Then he paused and said, but you could have an extra 2. So I've got 19 minutes. I'll try to finish in 15. I see myself talking in a context which, if I look back some 40 years ago when I got into the field, did not move in the direction that I expected. I was sure that in my lifetime, Palestine and Israel would be resolved. I was sure that the Middle East would move forward. For me, that remains a challenge for me to live until I'm 100 in order to see that. I see the world today as imploding and exploding. And I do not see great light at the end of the tunnel. And I think it's important to say that, because as soon as you begin to say there's light at the end of the tunnel, people let down rather than realizing and motivating themselves to be responsive. Let me give you a bit of a background on Islamophobia in about 4 minutes, and then I'll talk about where we're going. When I got into the field, the landscape in America and also in Europe was a landscape in which religiously one thought of Catholic, Protestant, and Jew. Not Islam, not Muslims, not Hinduism, not Buddhism. Not that there weren't people of those faiths in the country, but at that time they'd be identified, for example, with Islam as somebody's Lebanese or Egyptian, etc. It was also a world in which modernization and development theory was seen as the only way forward. As a prominent social scientist said in the passing of tradition, the choice for people in the Arab world, the choice for Muslims was Mecca or Mechanization. Religion was seen as an obstacle to change. And for the context in which we're discussing, consider the following. What this meant, in fact, was that Islam and the Muslim world were virtually invisible in most of our colleges and universities, let alone primary and secondary schools, with some exceptions. Invisible in terms of the politics. Religion, one didn't pay attention to the religious side. I asked a fellow who was in the Sudan for 3 years, did he know Hassan Turabi, Sadiq al-Mahdi? Not no, but was he aware of them? Had he followed them? He said, well, I was the economic officer. So in the middle of a time when this situation was taking place. In the media, invisible. Training of diplomats, invisible. In the academia, the academy, absolutely invisible. In fact, non-existent. It's the American Academy of Religion, of which I was proud to become president a few years ago. When I joined the American Academy of Religion, there was no section on Islam. There was no coverage of Islam. And so it was new for some of us to suggest that should be there. And this is the academy in the world to deal with the world's religions. The Middle East Studies Association. You didn't have panels on the role of Islam in the Middle East. What changed everything in all those sectors was the Iranian Revolution. The Iranian Revolution, though, became the lens through which people looked at the Muslim world. I often say that I owe my career, having finished my degree in 1974, when no one was interested in hiring somebody in Islam, getting books published, etc. 79 and 80 came along, and I got a career and my first Lexus. The second was even more important than the first, but in any case, so I don't buy American. All right. The reality of it is, though, that was the lens for many in the West, for many Americans and had no background in terms of media, education, etc. What did they see every day? People shouting death to America in the streets, hostages being taken and held. Tom Brokaw, who moderated a very famous show in the morning, which is still going on NBC in the morning, stopped the broadcast before they had a report on what was happening to the hostages and said, let me tell you something about Islam. He said, there's a religion called Islam. It's the second largest of the world's religions. It has a prophet named Muhammad and a book called the Quran. Full stop. He felt that that basic a background was necessary. And yet, any American who would travel any place in the world, or any European, would think that anybody who was educated or literate in another part of the world would have heard the word Bible, Moses, and Jesus. But there was no sense of that gap. Now, a decade before, Samuel Huntington and Bernard Lewis talked about the clash of civilizations, and many people aren't aware of this. Edward Said, who did a masterful job on Orientalism in 1981, wrote the following: for the general public in America and Europe today, Islam is news of a particularly unpleasant sort. The media, the government, the geopolitical strategist, and I love the next part, and academic experts, although they're marginal to the culture at large, are all in concert on one thing: Islam is a threat to Western civilization. This is 1981. Now, this is by no means the same as saying that only derogatory or racist caricatures of Islam are to be found in the West. But he said, what I am saying is that negative images of Islam are very much prevalent than any others, and that such images correspond not with what Islam is, but to what prominent sectors of a particular society take it to be. Islam in the West, a clash of civilizations. Those sectors have the power and the will to propagate that particular image of Islam, and this image, therefore, becomes more prevalent, more present than all others. Think about how many decades ago he said that. Now, when I refer to Islamophobia here, let me tell you what I'm talking about. Islamophobia is prejudice towards or discrimination against Muslims due to their religion or their perceived religious, national, racial, or ethnic identity associated with Islam. And it's that part that therefore leads to the attack and killing of Sikhs. You see, when one understands this. This is a form of racism, okay? This anti-Islam and anti-Muslim behavior has resulted in bias, discrimination, hate speech, and hate crimes in the US and Europe. But of course, it is found outside of the West, in countries like Myanmar, with regard to the Rohingya, and in Israel. In the 1990s, Islam came to be then talked about as a historical, political, civilizational, and demographic threat. And yet, in terms of the American scene, in contrast to Britain, which in 1990s in a major study identified this problem and called it Islamophobia, in America, the problem wasn't even seen. Not even with 9/11 in many ways. It was 2010, the so-called building of the mosque at Ground Zero. And for the first time in America, a major publication, Time magazine, its front cover said, "Is America Islamophobic?" And answered the question in the affirmative. At that time, I was doing a number of interviews with CNN. Otherwise, very bright reporters and producers stopped and said, "I don't understand what's going on. You know, what is this?" And I said, "You're seeing the tip of the iceberg. It's been out there for a couple of decades." There were articles every now and then, the Muslims are coming, but it was not a very visible paradigm in media. Not in mass media, and of course at that time, social media was negligible. Today, as polls confirm, and domestic and international politics reflect, acts of Muslim violent extremists and terrorists often brushstroke the vast majority of Muslims, threaten civil liberties, and distort the understanding of their faith. Why and how has that occurred? Fear of Islam has become normalized in popular culture. Why? Domestic and international terrorist attacks by AQ and ISIL, media in America, both mass and social media, American and European elections and politics have been major catalysts in what has occurred. And what's the result? The result, when we take a close look at it, is that there has been, since 2015, an exponential growth in Islamophobia in the US and in Europe. Public Religion Research Institute concluded no religious, social, or racial and ethnic group was perceived as facing greater discrimination in the US than Muslims. To what extent has media played a role, and a critical role? I'm going to quote statistics from an outfit called Media Tenor, T-E-N-O-R, so you can go up if you're interested in this. Media Tenor did a study of 975,000 pieces of European and American media. Okay? They discovered between 2001 and 2011. In 2001, looking at all that media, okay, where is Islam, where are Muslims in this? They discovered that 2% of the coverage of Islam and Muslims was with extremism, 0.1% on the broader context of the vast majority of Muslims, the vast majority of countries. 2011, the 2% jumps to 25%, but the broader context remains at 0.1%. Now, bad news gets worse. Media negativity has gotten absolutely much worse. In a study about a year ago, they discovered that over 80% of media coverage on Islam is negative. In the US and the UK and Germany, 9 out of 10 stories are negative. The majority of coverage has been on ISIS and other Islamist terrorist networks. Even coverage of mainstream, more than 50% negative. Images of Islam and Muslims, the vast majority of stories focused on war and conflict, terrorism, and violent jihad. What about social media? When you're dealing with social media, you're talking about what some of us called an organized Islamophobic network. And let me just say, if you want to see anything on anything I'm talking about, go to bridge.georgetown.edu. Bridge.georgetown.edu. If I were in the mood, I'd have you all repeat it out loud, but we'll just presume. Okay. Put it right now, those of you that are already looking at your iPads, etc., and not paying attention to me. All right. If we look at the funding for these groups, and I'll bottom line the funding, both the American Center for American Progress and CARE have done major studies on funding from major philanthropies to groups that are Islamophobic and to authors that are Islamophobic. The bottom line was a study in 2000 that looked at 2008 to 2013, $205 million. And if you add in a previous study, then you're jumping it to about $245 million going to these outfits that are created like Jihad Watch, Front Page, American Thinker, etc. That amount of funding for that policy. Where's the other side? Where's the other side represented in social media? The next big thing in America is, in terms of the influence, but it's also true in Europe, are elections. You've seen it in Europe recently in terms of the Netherlands, France, etc. In the US, it began with Obama, about 2008, 2012 presidential elections. Remember, we had a president that his advisors didn't want him photographed with anybody who had a hijab. We have a president who went to mosques overseas but waited until the end of his second term to go to a single mosque. I've often said to people, I would love Obama to go on a late-night TV show, have somebody ask him, what's it like not to be president anymore, and have him begin with Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Mashallah, it would be just perfect, but I don't think we could convince him to do that. All right, what we see in recent elections is a candidate, Mr. Trump, saying Islam hates us. Islam hates us, and there are lots of them. Not Muslim extremists hate us. We see other candidates talking about things like if a Muslim believes in Sharia, he would have to give it up, or he should be deported, or she should be deported. The Trump administration, if we look at its cabinet, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, Justice Department, as well as the executive director of the CIA, to just name a few. All of them in recent years, not specifically in the time that Trump's in office, but in recent years, have said, however different they are, Islam is not a religion. Islam is not a religion. It's a political ideology, dangerous, and we need to respond to it. Okay. America in the 21st century, I see you. But you don't want to correct your elders at this age. Otherwise, I might drop dead right in your lap. Okay. I'm finishing my conclusion. America in the 21st century is an extraordinarily multi-ethnic, multi-faith society. Many European countries today, the UK, France, Netherlands, Germany, and others, struggle increasingly with their becoming multi-ethnic and multi-faith societies, and the issues of immigration and national identity stand out. National identity and relations based on mutual understanding and respect, I always consider this really soft language. When we created the Center for Muslim Christian Understanding, they wanted to have mutual understanding and respect. I thought, oh, they're going to think it's like we're all going to hold hands and be nice. They'll lose the fact. So I put history and international affairs. This is what we're going to deal with. But in fact, even diplomats now use the phrase mutual relations and understanding and respect. And it has to be based on a religious and political pluralism. We haven't had that. A religious and political pluralism that acknowledges and accepts religious and ethnic diversity that it's critical in our times. We need to recognize our shared belief and values without denying we have differences and the uniqueness of our specific traditions. We don't have to give that up. But people of faith and no faith are challenged today to work together to develop healthy, inclusive pluralism that recognizes diversity and difference, but also the shared values. Tolerance should be thrown out or reinterpreted. If you tell me you tolerate me, that's an insult. Historically, tolerance just meant I don't kill you. It doesn't mean that I'd want to hire you, live near you, that I'd see you being equal to me, etc. We have to broaden, if we're going to use the word tolerance, so that we see the word as absolutely religiously and politically inclusive, and that becomes part then of national identity. Old notions of coexistence did not include equality and civil liberties. Pluralism in the West, and I would also add and emphasize in the Ummah with regard to religious minorities, sections of the Ummah, must be based on this political and religious inclusiveness and equality rather than exclusiveness. We in the West need to reaffirm and protect the centrality of American and European principles and values, equality of citizenship, pluralism, and civil liberties for all. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a very insightful and also engaging presentation. Final piece in this session is Dr. Sami Al-Arian, who will be talking about the challenge of settler colonization, particularly in Palestine, Israel.
Thank you, Jamal. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. I want to thank my co-panelists for inspiring presentations. This year marks the 100th year anniversary of the infamous Balfour Declaration that promised the land of Palestine to be a national Jewish home. It also marks the 50th anniversary of the Six-Day War, what's called the Six-Day War, where the rest of Palestine was colonized by Israel. It also marks the 24th, almost quarter of a century, anniversary of the flawed Oslo process, where it structured or validated from the decision makers in the Palestinian national camp the colonization of Palestine or the occupation of Palestine. The culprits, what we have witnessed in the past century is probably the best documented armed robbery in the history of mankind. The culprits were the Zionist movement, political Zionism, aided and abetted by the great or not so great Britain, United States, Germany, and other European powers. In the few minutes I have, what I would like to do is to present the framework in which we must understand this problem. This problem in the 19th century was called, in the words of Theodor Herzl, sometimes credited as the founder of political Zionism, the quote-unquote, the Jewish problem. In the 19th century, during the time of the Enlightenment and Emancipation, Jews were used to live in ghettos in Europe, but with the liberalism that was taking place, they were starting to be empowered in the societies they lived in, especially in Western Europe. This process was, on one hand, being encouraging Jews to assimilate within societies, and on the other hand, created more visible anti-Semitism, meaning anti-Jewish sentiments within Europe. It culminated sometimes in those that were not so liberal, like Russia, pogroms, which was basically wholesale persecution of Jewish communities, but also it engendered anti-Semitism within the societies that were supposedly more liberal, like Germany and France. The Zionist movement was born out of this, in addition to the emergence of the nation-state system on a large scale. It was, though, a minority view within the Jewish communities. There was a census during the Ottoman period in Palestine. The Ottomans were ruling Palestine at the time in 1878. There were about 462,000 citizens or residents in historic Palestine. Only about 15,000 or 3% constituted the Jewish community. These were the indigenous Jews who lived side by side for centuries, with hundreds of thousands of Muslims and about 10% or 40,000 or so Christians. Zionism, who was longing to establish a Jewish homeland for the Jewish problem in Europe, was looking for a land so that they can resolve this problem. This became or accelerated after the Dreyfus affair in France. The Dreyfus affair was basically a manifestation of anti-Semitism about one officer within the French army. Without going through details, that awakened in Herzl, who was just a journalist covering this incident, that there is a problem that needs to be resolved. He did not care. He was totally secular, didn't care. To him, Judaism and Jews represented ethnicity rather than religious community. And he tried to awaken at least the elites among the Jewish communities and elites in Europe for the establishment of Jewish homeland. He didn't care whether it was in Argentina, Uganda, Cyprus, wherever he can find a land. Eventually he settled, or the Zionist movement settled in Palestine, because it does have sentimental and spiritual meanings, symbols. That view also was very minority among, as I said, the Jewish communities. But that coincided also with the imperialistic strategic vision, especially with Great Britain, with England. They wanted to weaken the Ottoman Empire. They were looking ahead strategically. And they started actually advocating the establishment of a Jewish homeland, which, as I said, culminated in the Balfour Declaration, along with the Zionists in the aftermath, or right around the end of World War I. This myth that this was a land without a people, as I said, is simply a myth. Palestinians lived throughout the centuries, basically as farmers. There were over 1,000 villages in Palestine, few urban areas. They lived in security and peace within other communities under the Ottomans for over 400 years. Zionism did not have its foothold, this program, political program of colonization of Palestine, until the end of World War II and the mandate, the British mandate. The British mandate in 1918, at that time, there were only about 3% still, maybe 30,000 out of a million, but still about 3%. Between 1918 and 1948, these 30 years, were the most significant in transforming Palestine and preparing the grounds for the establishment of a Jewish homeland that later became the State of Israel. Just to understand what was this particular program. Jews at the time only owned perhaps 1 or 2% of the land of Palestine. And this was a problem because they had to expand in order to establish a state. So during the British mandate, they tried their best to get them absentee lands. These were owned by non-Palestinians living in Syria and Lebanon, who were basically at one point or another were large families, tax collectors for the Ottomans. They were given these lands by the Sultan. Didn't live in Palestine, were given lots of money. It wasn't empty land, it was being farmed by farmers. These farmers usually would plant, cultivate, sell their products, but there would be taxes. Much of these taxes were not being collected. They would come 10 years later asking for a huge amount of tax, and when they will not be able to pay, obviously, they would just take over the land. There will be Palestinians who were under the British, controlled by the British, to get them out, followed by Zionist bulldozers, followed by the British Army. A Palestinian during the mandate, if they owned a gun, they would immediately be arrested and sent to life in prison. They would not be allowed to build houses, get licenses, build shops. It was a complete suffocation of Palestinian society. They would not be allowed to have schools. In 1938, right before the start of the Second World War, there were only 4 Palestinians who completed their bachelor degrees in the whole of Palestine. So without going through much detail, it was a colonizing project to prepare the grounds for the establishment of a Jewish state, Israeli state. Keep in mind, after all this, after the purchase of the absentee land laws, after the gifts that they gave them from state land, after kicking out the Palestinians because they didn't pay taxes, after all that, all what they owned was about 6.5%. And by the end of World War II, we're talking about where there were militias inside Palestine, settlements that were established, massive immigration, especially before 1933. At that time, we can see what's happening in Palestine. Palestinians were obviously felt threatened. About 1.3 million Palestinians, about 650 or so, so about 1 to 2 Jews. And that ended with taking this issue to the United Nations, ended up with a partition plan, 55% Jewish. Wow, wow. All right, let me skip all that. I'm just trying to set the framework because the essence of the 1948 war was the expulsion, the massive expulsion of 700,000 people. And no one talks about that today. That is the essence of the problem. Now, what happened also is that the colonization of Palestine took several stages, but was all based on wars and terrorism, from the villains to the victims of these wars and terrorism. What we ended up was a garrison military state, where the 1948, 1956, 1967, where the rest of Palestine was taken. Remember, we said 55% by the end of 1948 and the armistice, it was about 78%. By the end of 1967, the war, we're talking about whole of Palestine, Sinai, Golan. There was always these different plans that included ethnic cleansing. This is well documented. You can go and read Ilan Pape and all the Israeli historians, on the new historians, based on that, and you could see the full picture. And wars never stopped there. 1982. The Sabra and Shatila massacres and the driving out of Palestinian troops out of Lebanon. And then the Intifada came 87 through 91, which ended with the 1993 Oslo Accord in order to make the occupation more structured, and so on and so forth. Now, I'm skipping so much, but let me get to the crux of where we are today and what are the choices. During Oslo, Israel had three choices to make. And these choices would be choosing 2 out of 3 things. You can either have the land being Jewish or democratic. If they want to be Jewish and democratic, they call that 2-state solutions. If they want to keep the land and be democratic, then they have to incorporate the Palestinians who were under occupation since 1967, without any civil or human rights, basically a huge prison camp. That would be the 1-state solution. Or they could choose the land and stay Jewish, and that would constitute an apartheid, which they didn't want, obviously, to have. But the effect is that that's what we have today. The whole Zionist goal is how we can have the land and not have the people. In that context, you can understand what happened with Gaza. They were willing to leave Gaza, which is only 2.5–3% of Palestine, because it had 2 million. They were immediately got rid of 2 million, but with choking effect. They have the ability to control Gaza at their leisure, and what we have today is just a huge prison. And the goal that those people who call for justice, call for equality, call for freedom, must be the total dismantlement of Zionist institutions. And I say that, believing in it, that the problem is not that we need to have a 2-state solution or a 1-state solution. The problem is, the essence of the problem is the Zionist project that must be totally dismantled. And that does not mean whatsoever the Jewish people. The Jewish people are part and parcel of this area. The reason we have Jews today in the Middle East is because when they were exiled from Islamic Spain in 1942, the Muslim world took them. When Jews came to the Ottoman Sultan, he opened doors for them. They had the right to come to any part of the Muslim Ummah, the vast Muslim lands. They could come to Palestine or come to others, but not as occupiers, not as colonizers, not as people who would like to assert sovereignty over others. That would be totally rejected. This is Zionism. But they have every right to live in any part of the Muslim world. If Europe doesn't want them, we welcome them. But not as colonizers, not as occupiers. And that's what needs to be totally rejected and dismantled. Now we have 2 ways of doing this. There is a peaceful way of doing it, and there is a non-peaceful way of doing it. And what we are faced today is obviously with the peaceful way. We go the route of South Africa. South Africa in the 80s and early 90s, it was an apartheid regime, very similar, not quite, but very similar to what Palestinians have today in Palestine, especially in the West Bank and Jerusalem. And that system of apartheid, the whole world, the US was the last one to join reluctantly, the whole world came against this. And they were able to force a nuclear state at the time, South Africa, to give up apartheid and to open up the system where all citizens would be equal. And the majority would have their fair share in self-determination and in ruling themselves. So what we have today is that possibility, and we have a promising movement called BDS, Boycott, Divestment, Sanction Movement, that is capable, actually, if the whole world, especially we start in the south. I don't have to start in the north. If I start just in the south, in Turkey, in other places across the Muslim world, in Africa, in Asia, embracing this movement and pressuring Israel, people could use hundreds of rockets. This will not have the same effect if we can mobilize on a movement that peacefully can dismantle racism and racial superiority embodied in that Zionist state, or it could come at a non-peaceful means, because this area will never, will not just stay weak all over. One day it will wrap itself and it will bring itself up and strengthen its powers. And I hope that they doesn't come to the point where it's done violently. I hope we can end the colonization of Palestine peacefully. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sami. Before I open it up to the floor, I'm actually going to start discussing with our panel some of the questions first, maybe to trigger a few discussion points. In order of just how things panned out, maybe, or actually, let's mix it up a bit. Dr. Flynt, I wanted to ask you about something significant. I understand, obviously, with everybody's coming with their own specific background, and I'm not sure if your presentation through the sphere of kind of like the America's view of the Middle East is because of that background, or because of maybe conviction that the status quo in terms of US power and grip over the region, that's what led you to it. But I mean, the idea of looking at the Muslim world through a US-centric perspective is obviously, I know you were saying, there's a need for re-engagement with, for example, China, Russia, and so forth, and that would bring about a balance of power. But that for me is troublesome, because what that means is two things. Number one, people are still looking at the Muslim world from this fear of outside interest and not inside, because even if you believe that by opening up to China and Russia that's going to give some sort of equilibrium that would empower, it only empowers through what the Russians or the Chinese would allow for this region, which is something that's a problem, because all it is substituting one colonization for another, no?
It's a fair point. The reality is, because of geography, because of resources, because of a lot of reasons, outside powers outside this region have looked on this part of the world, engaged with this part of the world in force and with imperial or colonial intent for several centuries at this point. And I think great powers are going to continue to have their own reasons for wanting to engage with this part of the world. I think that diversification in how countries in the region relate to those great powers is in regional countries' interests, because it creates more space in which countries of the region actually have a choice, and because they have a choice, they can have a better chance of setting the terms by which outside powers engage in the region.
In order for them to have a choice, they need to have self-determination that
yes.
Hegemony has to be essentially overcome. And maybe before I get to come back to Dr. Falk, I want to ask Dr. Esposito with regards to that quest for having that self-determination. Obviously, a large part of it is, and why we're discussing this now, is overcoming those challenges. And one of those challenges, obviously, you mentioned, you discussed, obviously, is that of Islamophobia, and I think it's more important, or sometimes significantly more important maybe than others, because when you're dealing with a challenge that is physical, like an occupation or a war, it's a lot more easier to identify. But even the discussion of Islamophobia, particularly in the West, that in itself, the definition of it isn't one that is commonly accepted. Its presence, for sure, is, and I know growing up in the United Kingdom, just to discuss it or put it on par with other forms of racism or other forms of discrimination, up until today, was still a challenge. And in order to have that self-determination, you need to break the barriers of being accepted in society. And you mentioned something very important, which was moving away from tolerance towards what you called inclusion, I would say acceptance. And I think it's you make something very significant, because you tolerate a rash or a pain in the back. You don't essentially tolerate somebody who you accept for it. My question is, how do you suggest that Muslims move from Muslims, from their perspective, what they need to do in order to force society to move from tolerance to acceptance, and what the powers that be in society, be it soft powers of academia, media, and so forth, or political ones, start accepting that diversity and pluralism?
And there are differences, I would point, I just start with, between Muslims in the US and Muslims in Europe, in terms of who went where and where they are in terms of the mosaic of the country. But if we're looking at the American situation, Muslims have moved in a matter of decades from the periphery to the center. That is, studies that have been done by Pew, I should mention, for, transparency, that I was associated with Pew, but not Pew, I'm sorry, Gallup and Pew have talked about the fact that basically American Muslims are educationally, economically, and socially integrated in general. In fact, the Muslim community in America is second to the American Jewish community in terms of education excellence. And the challenge that Muslims in that situation have is, from my point of view, to increase their ability organizationally to have leverage. They need more organizations, actually, than less, and they need to support them. You know, in the past, support would only come when there was a visible crisis, an invasion into a country. Okay. The other is to have more and more people come into the electoral process, and that's just beginning. But given the fact that things have gotten worse rather than better in terms of Islamophobia, and certainly in terms of the rhetoric under this particular administration, that makes it even more difficult in terms of those to come into the system. That is why it is incumbent upon, I believe, Americans who are not Muslim to join in this struggle. I'll give you just one concrete example. What should have struck everybody is that when Trump and his administration announced the ban, within hours, you had thousands of people go to the airport. But what was different was that the thousands of people included a significant number of non-Muslims and people from a variety of NGOs that came to realize that there's a basic underlying set of principles and values that America stands for, and that therefore, if you are somebody who believes that Black Lives Matter, if you're somebody who believes in civil liberties and civil rights, etc., that this is very much part of the struggle with Muslims. And I think you also see in the American Muslim community, Muslims moving to that next stage. That is, with their organizations, not simply as most ethnic and religious groups do when they first come in, you stay to yourself, you develop social programs or medical programs for your own, but rather embracing out. But we're at a critical juncture, because it would be different if we could talk about these things and you could say that things are getting better because Muslims have moved in America more to the center in some areas. They have not politically. And so that's why I think, it really is a challenge in terms of moving forward.
But there's a contradiction there, because what you're saying is that actually Muslims have managed to move to the center, or developed more in terms of being more integrated, but at the same time Islamophobia is getting higher. And I think actually the question here is it not the case that those Muslims who are being more integrated are actually being co-opted more by the system? And rather than, just to use the example you used as coming second to the Jewish community, where you have the Jewish community may be working more towards a common ground and a common aim of, let's say, the protection of interests of the State of Israel, you do not have those working to the common, because there isn't a common concept of the protection of the ummah?
Well, I think that you're right, but I think things are changing. First of all, with regard to the American Jewish community, it's far more divided today in terms of Palestine and Israel. And more older and more senior, let's say American Zionists, are very concerned that they're not holding on to the newer generation. I think with regard to the Muslim community, there is a danger in that part of the process of every ethnic and religious group is to integrate and become absorbed. But one of the problems, if you're a minority and you're a minority that feels that you're discriminated against, is that you go to change your identity. You know what I mean? So, for example, Italian Americans of my generation, some, depending on where they lived in America, changed their name, you changed, etc. And you see a significant number of Muslim youth background who want to move forward, and they want to avoid that baggage. On the other hand, you do see far more of an involvement of the younger generation, and you see it in organizations. You take a group like CARE. You know, for the Muslim organizations used to be like many Muslim organizations in the Muslim world, which is you found an organization and you're in your 40s, and you let go of that organization the way rulers in many Muslim countries let go of it when you die, or when you're forced out.
Or you give it to your son.
That's right, or you give it to your son. But here, what we see is, for example, in CARE, the number of younger generation and also the number of women that are coming in, MPAC, etc. So I think there's hope there. But I still feel a need at times to just emphasize that the situation is dire. So, you know, if you just say that there's this improvement, you forget that on the other side, there's this, you know, and Charlottesville and the problem we had there gives you a good sense of what that issue can mean.
Dr. Falk, you were talking about how, for example, the US has still not realized that it can no longer enforce its hegemony through military presence, and the lessons maybe it should have learned in Vietnam were never really learned. But it's interesting because the challenge for the Muslim world, either be it Muslim majority countries or Muslim communities, in kind of liberating themselves, and I mean that on every level, be it economic, social, political, and cultural, is different, or it sometimes almost becomes easier if the hegemony is manifested in, as I was saying, a physical thing, so you know what your enemy is. So actually, as far as the Muslim world is concerned, it's a lot easier for them to realize that they are enslaved when you see tanks on the streets than it is for those, for example, in Egypt and other post-Arab Spring countries that never understood that what had come about in 2011 was an attempt to liberate them from colonization that wasn't very visible to the uneducated.
No, that's a very well-formulated question. Of course, I tried to make your point in my own presentation, because what I tried to say was that the hardest form of hegemony to combat was the form that you couldn't see. That was the internalized Orientalism that continues to rely on Western ways of thinking and cultural categories and political categories, and that part of the empowering of an alternate paradigm or a new imaginary based on ummah is to at least engage with this internalized hegemony. But the external, it's not correct. I didn't mean to give the impression that the U.S. has given up its militarized foreign policy. I said it's failed and repeatedly failed, but because it's invested so heavily in the military machine and the militarized, what Flynt was talking about in terms of its militarized foreign policy, it hasn't got the political imagination to think of other ways of achieving its goals in the world. And so it's stuck within this failing paradigm of relying on its military superiority to achieve change. And what the decolonization movement, I think, proved was that the weaker side in almost every late 20th century conflict prevailed politically. military power, in other words, lost the agency it had during the colonial era, when it really was an efficient way of projecting control. The great change in the 20th century was the decline of military agency for changing conditions in the world. But the U.S., unlike Europe, has not learned that lesson. So it continues to inflict great suffering on various parts of the world by relying on military power that doesn't do what it purports to do. Military superiority does not control political outcomes in these internal struggles.
But it does generate a lot of money for some.
Arms sales and lots of things like that.
I am going to open up to the floor, but first I just want to ask Dr. Sami something, which is the interesting thing. There is a common denominator between your topic and those of your three predecessors, which is the issue of Palestine is linked to everything. So whether you're talking about the Zionist groups that fund Islamophobic organizations in the United States, or the parents in the decades-long occupation of Palestine. My question is, what do you solve first? Do you, in order to try and solve the Palestinian issue, have to tackle each one of those kind of issues and others that also are linked to it? Or is it an attempt for the Muslim world to actually focus purely and specifically on the Palestine question in order to solve the other ills and challenges that afflict it?
Very good question. They're all linked, as you said. But I think we have enough participants and actors that you can deal with them. People who are closer to the issue of Palestine, especially inside Palestine, those who are directly involved in it, the states around it, would probably be more focused on how to confront the occupation, how to deal with it. Those who are activists in the issue of Palestine, they will be promoting BDS and try to make it a worldwide successful movement. At the same time, those who are dealing with American hegemony, whether in particular countries or regions or even outside, they will be dealing with it. They will also be contributing to the solution or resolution of Palestine or the Palestinian cause. Those who are dealing with Islamophobia in the West, especially, they would directly be involved, because the more you are successful in Islamophobia, the more you are challenging the Zionist narrative, because they are totally linked. And actually, those who are the most Islamophobes are the ardent Zionists in the West. So I feel that you can't work on one and neglect the other. You have to work all in tandem, all at the same time. But at the same time, we need to understand that they are linked. And Palestine today, whether we understand it, see it or not, is really the central focal point. The more, if you want to see the ascendants or the descendants of our issues and cause, just look at Palestine. If you are winning, if you see the line going up, that means you are actually making inroads. And likewise, if you see the settlement movement growing and Israel is relaxed, that means we're really on the descendants. At the same time, we can look at the regional things. Look at the Arab Spring as an example. What happened in 2011, 2012, 2013, when the collective will of the Arab Revolutionary Movement was going in the right direction, Israel was contracting, was afraid that its project is being demoralized and threatened. And when the counter-revolutionaries had the upper hand, it felt more relaxed, and actually everybody is looking up to Israel as being their protector.
To speak to that, actually, I remember reporting from Tahrir in Tunisia and Yemen and Syria, and actually throughout all of those protests before things got violent and stuff, the interesting thing would be that you would always find Palestinian flags. So whether it was in the pro-revolutionary protests in Egypt or in Libya even, or in Syria. So the Palestinian issue has and always manifested itself as being central to the struggle for self-determination across the Arab and Muslim world. I do want to open it up to questions. I see a lot of hands going up. As somebody who was raised by an ardent feminist, I am going to try and find some women to ask some questions, if there are any there, because we haven't heard from our female audience, if there is anybody. Preference there? No? Mama, don't say I didn't try. Okay, so let's start with the president of the university here, and then we'll...
Just two questions to Professor Leverett. You suggest for Turkey to make a kind of balance in between the powers in the region using Russia and China. Two questions. First one, if Turkey is starting to use this machine stronger than before, what can be the policy of United States in two issues, in Kurdish issue and Gulen movement issue? How United States can use these two machines? And the second question is, what can do Russia and China for the region, specifically on Kurdish issue?
Okay. Let's take, if you could make note, we'll take them in threes, and then see. Over there, please, and then...
Hello. My question is for Dr. Falk, and Dr. Leverett maybe can comment. I'm very interested in the power of Islamic economics in this region, and that being a tool for counter-hegemony. However, that optimism has sort of waned over the years when we see that what could be an alternative model of economics really conform to just a hyper-capitalist model. So the entire Islamic finance industry, in many ways, critics will say, has moved in the wrong direction. Do you think that there's existing structures in Islamic economics or in other sectors like aid and development where we can build counter-hegemonic spaces that have territorial integrity, structural integrity? And what would those spaces look like?
This question over here on the right, and then we'll take this as the third answer, and then we'll come back to...
A question for Professor Richard Falk. I was wondering if he could draw upon his wisdom and erudition to tell us how Muslims in this part of the world, at least, can pursue counter-hegemony ethically. In other words, there are many counter-hegemonic movements in the world today that seek to, in the name of an alleged authenticity, to reject the ruling paradigm of liberal elites in Europe, in India, in the United States, but in the name of a right-wing reactionary populism. So my specific question is, what are the red lines in terms of pursuing a counter-hegemony in the Muslim world so you don't replace one hegemonic sort of paradigm with a worse one?
Okay, so let's answer these, and then we'll take another set of questions. We'll start with Dr. Falk, and then move down to...
The question about Islamic economics is a really crucial issue. I don't feel competent to really address what is the potential within the Muslim world for gaining what used to be called delinking from the overriding structures of neoliberal globalization. But it's if there is to be a empowerment within the Muslim Ummah, it will have to include this kind of achieving a degree of economic autonomy that allows the distinctive values associated with Islam to be introduced into economic life, and that includes Islamic banking, which I think is very important in this stage of finance. I know that the initial president of Iran, Banisadr, had thought a lot about what does an Islamic economy really look like? And how is it different from a capitalist for-profit with interest on capital and so on? Whether that's been actualized in Iran to any extent, I'm skeptical about. But I think it's one of these questions that maybe this center can explore, is to what degree is there a potential for achieving that kind of delinked economic autonomy that will allow a more authentic form of, let me put it this way, a form of economics that's more congruent with Islamic culture and civilization and religion. As far as that very difficult question about the pursuit of counter-hegemonic policies or approaches ethically, I certainly, one thing Americans should stop doing is advising Muslims and others how to solve these problems. It's been a disastrous record, you know, with very few exceptions. These kind of issues have to be solved from within. That's really the hard work of self-determination, is to take the responsibility for imagining and acting upon the values that one seeks to achieve. And of course, the most obvious universal value, I think, is to avoid violence against those who are innocent. And that's, for me, a red line that is trans-civilizational. And everything else is contingent on what others do and what the possibilities are for seeking liberation. And those that are oppressed don't need lectures from those that are detached. The learning of how to struggle against oppression is a existential reality for oppressed peoples.
Okay. Thank you very much. Dr. Flynt?
I want to take up your question about if, say, Turkey diversifies its extra-regional partnerships, which I tend to think it's doing anyway. But to the extent it does that or goes further down the road, how would the U.S. react on these two issues that you raised? I tend to think that the question is, I mean, first of all, in a sense, how much worse can U.S. policy get on those issues from a Turkish perspective? And realistically, how much better could U.S. policy get? And I tend to think on both the Kurdish issue and on the Gülen case, that U.S. policy isn't likely to get dramatically worse than it is right now from a Turkish perspective. But I also don't think it's going to get much better from a Turkish perspective on those issues, regardless of what Turkey does. On Gülen, I would say, because of the nature of American law, because of the nature of the American immigration system, that even if you had a president who was fully committed, yes, I think the Turks have a good case with regard to Gülen, and in the interest of advancing U.S. relations with Turkey, my administration would support his extradition. The reality is that someone in that situation, in Gülen's situation, would have an amazing number of avenues for contesting that decision in American courts. And I'm not exaggerating what I'm about to say. I don't think it would be difficult for Gulen with good lawyers to, even if the Trump administration said today, yeah, let's extradite him. I don't think Gulen would have much difficulty tying that up in American courts for at least 10 years, if not longer. I mean, at least 10 years, and his lawyers wouldn't have to work that hard to do that. That to me sort of says there's a limit to how much satisfaction you're actually likely to get from the United States on the Gulen issue. And, you know, so in a sense, in terms of bigger strategic issues, you don't need to let that constrain you. You know, no matter what you do, you're not going to get a much more satisfying outcome from the United States, I think. Kurds, you know, I think there too, there's a limit to how much worse U.S. policy can get on the Kurds. And I understand why, from a Turkish perspective, U.S. policy is very problematic. The reality, though, is that while the U.S. loves to use Kurdish militias periodically for various regional objectives, the reality is if the United States ever actually formally supported Kurdish independence, you know, it would lose virtually all of its allies in the region. Even the Saudis, the Emiratis won't support Kurdish independence. Now, Turkey has special sensitivities on the issue, so I mean, in a way, Turkey gets more upset faster than other regional players because of Turkey's special sensitivity exposure to the Kurdish issue. But nobody in the region, I mean, other than, I think, Prime Minister Netanyahu really, you know, is openly supporting creation of a Kurdish state. And I think that will be a constraint on how bad U.S. policy could get on this issue. Russia and China, you know, as far as I can see, they both have, for their own reasons, they have a pretty strong commitment to the principle of maintaining the territorial integrity of existing states. If you start to play with that principle, they think they have all kinds of issues that could become really difficult for them to manage. And so even though Russia is now investing in oil and gas, or said it will invest in oil and gas projects in Iraqi Kurdistan, my sense is that the Russians still, their position is they support the territorial integrity of existing states. And I think I think that's going to continue to be the Russian position and the Chinese position on those issues.
Dr. Richard, just wanted to add one thing.
Just a sentence. I think it's a really interesting question about how independent Turkey can, how constructively independent Turkey can be in the region. And I think you can't answer that question without taking account of Israel's influence on U.S. foreign policy, which I think would be a constraint in moving in a direct. When Turkey tried to solve the Iran nuclear problem, the U.S. and Israel reacted very strongly, and there was a kind of backlash. So one has to factor in this independent Israeli role in the region and the Israeli influence behind the scenes in the shaping of American foreign policy in the region.
Okay, we'll take one more round of questions. The lady, no, up at the very top, please.
My question is for Professor Esposito. You So a lot of people argue that Islamophobia isn't a form of racism because Islam is a religion, not a race. And I know you touched upon this in your presentation, but how do we articulate this? And can you expand upon that?
We'll just take two more and then two more questions. Yeah. Sorry. Who else? Sorry. There was a few other hands I saw. I mean, he's... this one over here?
Yes, she's
okay.
Waiting a long time.
Assalamu alaikum. I appreciate all.
With regard to the question of racism, I mean, quite frankly, I was kind of slow to really see this a few years ago. And in fact, even when Ibrahim Khalil and I did a book and we had somebody write on it, I began to have a sense that the point of the racism side is that racism really is, in terms of Muslims, is in the eye of the beholder. That is of, quote, you know, your average American and your average European, and the way they see and respond to somebody. And a good deal of the way someone sees and responds is that they look like a Muslim, which of course is a joke when you realize the diversity of Muslims and, if you will, their facial structures, you know, etc. But it is, and the way in which, therefore, we see today the right, the ultra-right in Europe and America, that often the rhetoric is one that is based on race. So, for example, in the United States, we talk about the right and the way it reacts, and the fact that, as the FBI has acknowledged, Southern Poverty Law Center for a couple of years, that the real threat, the real terrorist threat, is white anti-American groups. But these anti-American groups are, in fact, they take a racist approach with regard to blacks, Jews, and Muslims. And when you then see attacks or people responding in the street, etc., they go for visible signs. Now, one of the visible signs, of course, is the hijab in women. But the other is, you know, when people are attacked, it's that they look like a Muslim. You know, and as I said before, you know, Sikhs have had a particular issue. With regard to the Rand report and the moderate and liberal, the fact is that one of the issues that we have, the big thing today is combating violent extremism, you know, the so-called CVE, combating violent extremism. And I can remember only 2 or 3 years ago, an ambassador at the UN saying, you know, we really need to, and he was not an Arab, we really need to address the Palestinian question. He's really crucial. But he said, in all of my meetings, all people want to talk about is combating violent extremism. And I've seen it, been involved in addressing or participating in this issue, both, let's say, in the US and also the EU. What often happens, and at the UN, what often happens is that there's a division within these institutions. For example, there was a major program at the UN. What happens with anybody who speaks at anything is to say it was a major program. Trust me, it was. But one of a million that day, probably. But there was a major program, and the ambassador who opened the session, and it was primarily to address, issues of Islamophobia, issues, how it impacts domestic and foreign policy. But one of the first things he said was that at the UN itself, that so many of his colleagues, there was a real division as to what's the problem in terms of, radicalism, and they attribute it to religion. The same thing happens in the US, and the same thing can happen at the EU, where the word Muslim comes up all the time when they're talking about, there's something about Islam, there's something, and of course the Islamophobic outfits say this. Their rhetoric is very much based that there's something about that religion. There's a group called Act for America. Okay, well, that group has support from American politicians, particularly Republicans, a presidential candidate like Cruz, General Flynn, who was initially with the Trump administration, I think was on their board or is on their board. And when they talk about terrorism, extremism, they will say the problem is Islam itself, and they will say, if you have somebody who's an observant Muslim, or if you will, if they're therefore called a moderate Muslim, no, they're dangerous because Islam is the problem. So if they're moderate and they pray regularly and they read the Quran, in fact, it means they are preconditioned Now, data by both Gallup and Pew, starting with the world polls of Gallup from 2001 to 2008, and then more recent stuff by Pew, shows that very clearly the major catalysts and drivers in the region are, in fact, political and economic grievances. One of the things that I often say to people is go back and look at bin Laden's first speeches, particularly his CNN interview. It was pages of appealing to the political and economic grievances in the region, and then at the end he pulled in religion and theology to then legitimate the opposition to it. In terms of a new narrative, that is part of the challenge to Orientalism. One of the things with our Bridge project is that we realize that when we talk about a new narrative, the danger when you say a new narrative is you think, oh, it's going to be a discourse. Okay? So how people think or speak, so you're going to write articles, etc. That's not really, that's only part of the new narrative. The new narrative has to be based on life. What is Islam? Who are Muslims? One needs to see interviews, vignettes, on who these Muslims are. And it's not just that you're emphasizing their, if you will, Islamicness. It's the fact that you see them as integral and a part of society. There's a very interesting story last year. A woman won this big bake sale. And apparently it's a big event in the UK. And she was a Muslim. And she was covered. But at no point did they sort of say, there's a Muslim. But too often, that's the way it is presented. So it's seeing that broader narrative. And the broader narratives are there. Muslims in America and Europe, I know the American scene and the British scene better than some other parts. We have a guest here, Fareed Hafiz, who's an expert on it. But Muslims are now very visible in international relief for everybody. I know a woman, and I know this is going on, but tough. I know a woman, I was just watching her recently. Have any of you seen Legacy of the Prophet? That was done by, well, you should get it. Anyway, Legacy of the Prophet looked at Muslims as they are about 10 or 15 years ago. People thought it was just going to be, on the history of the life of the Prophet. And so it showed a woman who was a nurse in a hospital dealing in Dearborn with a lot of people, including Arabs and Muslims. She went to set up an incredible NGO, and I hadn't seen her for a few years. She completely redefined it. It's called Zaman. She realized, wait a minute, if I'm a nurse, I respond to humanity. I want to say insan. I don't just respond to Muslims who are sick. And so if I'm going to, in America, respond to the situation, and so she's now broadened it so that she actually moved it also into the worst, one of the worst areas in Detroit, where 49% of women are single mothers and make less than $12,500. And she deals with that population. The vast majority of them are not even Muslim, and that's, I think, where we need to go in terms of the narratives. But you don't get it out. The media doesn't cover that. You still get, just the other day, you'll have to excuse me because this is being taped, but I'm going to use language you might not like, but that's too bad. A person in an audience said to me, but why don't Muslims speak out against violence? Now, I've been hearing that since 9/11. And I said, smiling, with all due respect, that's bullshit. And he looked stunned. He was I said, and then I stepped back. I said, that's a response of somebody who's heard this for 10 years. I said, but you're right. You don't see this in the media. But if you go on the internet, if you go to Bridge, we show thousands of statements made since 9/11. So the challenge is getting the narrative out.
Thank you very much, Dr. Esposito. And Dr. Flynt and Dr. Falk, and of course, Dr. Sami, who I think is going to occupy the chairman's.
I'm against occupation. Well, thank you so much for a very good panel, very good discussion. We're just going to give some awards, please. John, please. Jamal. Next, we have lunch until 3 o'clock, about 1 hour. If you have a colored badge or